Good evening. I'm Heather Campion, the CEO of the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you along with my colleague Tom Putnam, the director of the library, here in the front row. This library and museum is a national treasure, and it's one of only 13 presidential libraries in the country. Our mission is to carry President Kennedy's timeless vision and ideals forward, so welcome. Here at the library, we've just completed a renovation of our museum downstairs for the first time in decades, and hope you'll come back to see it. It's now full of new technologies, including remastered films of President Kennedy's most iconic speeches on big screens and living color, and you can explore much more of our collection through the interactive displays that we've also now brought to the museum. It's really a whole new way to experience President Kennedy, his timeless ideas and courage and inspiration that he brought to the world, so we hope you'll make time to come back. Here in our forum, we've also recently introduced new technologies to enable people all over the world to view these programs, which are now being live streamed and webcast through our website. All of our social media, you can see it on YouTube, where we have a channel, on Twitter, on Facebook, on Tumblr. And this is thanks to the generous support from our sponsors, our leading sponsor, Bank of America, the Boston Foundation, the Lowell Institute, Raytheon, and Viacom. Our media partners also help us to make these much more widely available to the public, so I want to recognize the Boston Globe, WBUR, and Xfinity. It's now my pleasure to welcome two icons in the world of politics and the internet. Congressman Barney Frank, who represented the 4th Congressional District in Massachusetts for nearly 5 decades, also my congressman for many years, I might add, and Chris Hughes, one of Facebook's earliest recruits. Congressman Frank is no stranger to this library, to Massachusetts, or to the country. But we're delighted that he's written his memoir so we could have him back one more time. It's entitled Frank, A Life in Politics from the Great Society to Same-Sex Marriage. It is now on the New York Times bestseller list, and it's on sale in our museum store, and Congressman Frank will be signing copies of it at the conclusion of this forum. This book is a great read, and as you can imagine, it's animated by his passionate beliefs in the power of government as a force for good and for civil rights, two issues that were also passionate ideals for President Kennedy. Just to give you an idea of what's in store for you when you read this book, I just want to read you the very opening line. In 1954, I was a fairly normal 14-year-old, enjoying sports, unhealthy food, and loud music. But even then, I realized there were two ways in which I was different from the other guys. I was attracted to the idea of serving in government, and I was attracted to the other guys. Well, as we all know, Barney Frank did go into government, and in 1986, he decided to come out, becoming the first member of Congress to voluntarily disclose his homosexuality. And he's been one of the most effective and articulate advocates for the LGBT community ever since. Perhaps it is his own lifelong struggle against inequality that made him such a force during one of the worst economic crises this country's ever faced. As chair of the House Financial Services Committee, he co-authored the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act, the most far-reaching Wall Street reform since the Great Depression. Finally, this book is an inspirational reminder of how government service matters, and that every citizen must be involved in making our democracy work. As we so often find here at the JFK Library, President Kennedy's words seem so perfectly suited to the challenges of our time. So I thought I'd share this quote from his book on Profiles in Courage on this topic. In a democracy, every citizen, regardless of his interest in politics, holds office. Every one of us is in a position of responsibility. And in the final analysis, the kind of government we get depends upon how we fulfill those responsibilities. We, the people, are the boss, and we will get the kind of political leadership, be it good or bad, that we demand and deserve. I think the people of the 4th District in Massachusetts who reelected Barney Frank over and over again by wide margins, would happily say that they got the political leadership from Barney Frank that they deserved. I now want to introduce the perfect moderator for this evening's discussion, Chris Hughes. At Harvard College, he was one of Mark Zuckerberg's roommates, became a co-founder of Facebook. He later went on to become the organizer of Barack Obama's 2008 online presidential campaign efforts, and today he's the owner and publisher of The New Republic, a 100-year-old magazine about politics and culture that is transforming under his leadership into a multi-platform digital media company. He is also the embodiment of the growing cultural tolerance that Barney applauds in his book. Barney and Chris were married to their respective partners within weeks of each other in 2012. I can't imagine a better duo to talk about our government and our future. Please welcome Barney Frank and Chris Hughes.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that wonderful and kind introduction, and thank you, Congressman, for taking the time on a Monday evening to sit down and have a conversation like this. I have to say, I read these kind of books pretty often, and for those of you who haven't yet read it, this is a real pleasure to read. You find yourself immersed in so many different worlds from the 1960s all the way up through the present day. So it's a real privilege, and hopefully we can have a good conversation tonight. So I'm going to speak with the Congressman for a little bit less than an hour, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience. So as we're talking, feel free to note your ideas and what you're wondering about, and then we'll have people line up in a little bit. So I'd like to start off with a very small issue, the crisis of faith in American government. It's where you start your book, and it's where you end your book. And I think it's fair to say that it's a central theme of our time. As you note in the beginning, when you came of age, America was a place that believed in government as a solution to many of our problems and hated gay people. And now, in 2015, it happens to be the exact opposite. So I'm wondering if you can help us understand, or help us understand how you think about what's at the root of the decaying faith in government. Where does it come from? What's the source? And what can we do about it?
Thank you, Chris, because that is the central problem I try to deal with in the book, and I think it is it's the central political problem, I think, for America today, particularly for those of us who are liberals and want to see the government resume the role that I think we need if we're going to improve the quality of our lives. First, I didn't make this quite as explicit in the book, and as I've been talking about the book, and questions like yours have helped me hone this, I want to make clear what it isn't. A few years ago, the popular explanation for why white working class men who used to vote, people who were in the demographic who used to vote for Democrats, for Harry Truman, Franklin Roosevelt, et cetera, why are so many of them not voting Democratic? And in fact, the statistics are very clear. The only group of white men who regularly vote Democratic are gays and Jews. That's a fact of life that you have to confront if you're going to deal with it. Now, the explanation a few years ago was that it was revulsion at the Democrats' position on social issues. Right. God, guns, and gays was the illustration. Thomas Frank, no relation, wrote, "What's the matter with Kansas?" And the explanation was that our cultural liberalism had driven the white working class away. I believe now that that is not true. The only one of that trilogy which has some problem for us is guns, and that still is an issue that hurts us somewhat. But I don't think that, and I talked to Democrats, the last people who lost because of the abortion issue were two right-wing nutcases out in Indiana and Missouri who had those ridiculous positions about legitimate rape and God wants you to have the baby if you're raped. As to gays, and this is particularly the case, I don't see how anyone could still maintain that it is support for gay rights that is driving white working class people away from the Democrats when Indiana suddenly goes on this pro-gay orgy of bashing their own governor. I mean, seriously, support you mentioned for equal treatment for LGBT people has gone as the drop in the other area has continued. And I think the answer is economics. And paradoxically to me, I think a lot of the anger that we hear from white working class guys about government is not that they don't believe in government philosophically. They're not Ayn Rand supporters. It's because they do think, and they know historically, that government has played a good role, and they are angry that their economic position is eroding, that inequality is increasing, that they're getting a very small share of increased prosperity, and they resent the fact that the government is doing more. And I think the issue is, as I said, economic reality. From beginning of World War II to well into the 70s, America had this economic domination in the world. During the war and then after the war, every advanced economy but ours was devastated by World War II. So in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, if you were an American without an advanced degree, without any specialized skills, but a willingness to work, and you were a white guy, so you weren't subjected to either gender or race prejudice, you made a good living. And that has been eroded by the development of the economy, both the nature of the economy within the country and America's place within the world. So we have a situation now where white working class men look back to their father's generation and see themselves worse off. And they are angry, and I think blame the government because it hasn't done anything. And here is the problem we have is that people see the Democrats as the party of government. It's frustrating to me. Democrats have had the House, the Senate, and the presidency for exactly 4 years out of the last 35, but we're still held accountable. And that, I will bring this to a close, that's where I think the gay and women and black issue comes in. It is not that these white working class guys are anti, it is that some of them do believe that if the liberals weren't so busy with affirmative action and on these other issues, we'd have more time for their issues. So to me, it's a vicious cycle. People are disappointed that government hasn't delivered, so they vote in anger for people who demonize government, which makes it less likely that government would deliver. And what I look for and try to say in the book is, how do we break out of this? And my proposal in the book is to break out of that by freeing up some of the money we're now spending so you could provide a college education for a working class kid for less than $1,000, so that you could put construction workers back to work and increase the number of them by doing all the infrastructure that we need, so that you could, in my judgment, reduce Medicare to 55 instead of 65 and take some of that burden off working people. And I believe if we were to do that, we could once again show people in this category that government can be a positive force in their lives. So that's my answer.
It's funny, though, because it seems like the cultural moment that we're in is headed in, almost exactly the opposite direction. In 2015, whether it's the rise of the Tea Party or the right, or in 2010, or even generationally. You look at millennials who, if not now, by later this year, there'll be more millennials than there are of any other generation. And those people, too, feel a sense of disappointment, feel a sense of skepticism about the role that government can play. And it seems like we can either go in one of two directions. One, the direction that you're articulating, or another where expectations for government are just meaningfully reduced. Most millennials don't think Social Security or Medicare will be around for them 40 years from now. So how do you speak to that generation of people?
I tell you, that's a very well put framing of it. I was reading, as I was thinking about the book and rereading some old columns, there was a column by Robert Samuelson, who I knew at Harvard, but who has become who was more liberal then, but he's become somewhat more conservative now. And he made this kind of same argument I made, that much of the anger is because of disappointment that government doesn't deliver on its promises. And his answer to that is, as you suggest, one possible outcome. Let's stop promising so much. My answer is no, it's important for us to have those promises because that's essential for the quality of life and for fairness, and we have to find a way to deliver on the promises. And again, as I said, there is a vicious cycle. As far as millennials are concerned, there are two things at work. First of all, and I absolutely agree with you, it has become fashionable to denigrate government, including on the left. we have two forms of voter suppression in this country. We have the actual outrageous legal voter suppression, where Republicans enact laws that make it harder for people to vote. These identification, show your birth certificate. I had a colleague in the Congressional Black Caucus when they were doing these things say, hey, my mother doesn't have a birth certificate because black women didn't get birth certificates in Mississippi in 1922. So, this is a real problem. And I think we should fight those, although sadly the Supreme Court, by gutting the Voting Rights Act, made it hard to do that. But we have intellectual suppression, voter suppression on the left. People who, and it's fashionable, government's no good, let's only talk about government's failures, don't vote because they don't pay any attention to you, they only listen to the big guys. I think it's important, first of all, for people to stop doing that and talk instead. You talk about millennials. I don't understand, and maybe this will come across. In the 2016 election, America will decide whether or not it's going to do anything going forward about climate change. Because if the Republicans win, it is very clear that that will be the end of any federal effort to deal with climate change. And if that doesn't get younger people involved, I speak to them and I say, listen, climate change, I'm going to be dead by then. So, I'm not asking you to do me a favor, but I would think you'd be worried about it. These are the, but again, I would have to say, I don't think you can talk people out of these deeply held, experience-based feelings. So that's why I believe, in short, if somebody suddenly found $100 billion divided up between the federal government, or $125 billion, that the federal government and the state and local governments could spend on programs, and we could increase those things that the government does and enhance the quality of life, they would be good in themselves, and I think they would begin to infuse people with this sense of what government can do. And the answer is that that money is available, not easily achieved politically, I think easily financially. If we scale back our military budget to a realistic assessment of what our true needs are, and we stop prosecuting people because we don't like the recreational drugs they use, we would free up enormous resources, reduce social harm in addition, and be able to break out of it. So that's what I'll spend the rest of my life trying to do.
So it's interesting at the end of the book, in some of the last few pages, don't worry, I'm not going to give it away, but you say that you plan to spend the rest of your post-congressional career focused on this question: how do we restore faith in government or change the way that people think about government as a positive force in their lives, instead of devoting or devoting little energy, you say, to LGBT issues, which is something that throughout the book you chronicle, your own experience, humbly so, but your constant fight for LGBT people over the years, from the Massachusetts legislature on through the present day. In a scenario where you believe that it's more important to fight for faith in government, does that mean on most LGBT issues, have we won? I mean, it's a...
I filed the first gay rights bill in Massachusetts in 1972. Before I was out, I made the decision in 1972, made two decisions. One, I will be a coward. Two, I will not be a hypocrite. I will not tell people I'm gay, but I will not be one of those gay people who, from the closet, supports the persecution of other gay people. So I've been involved for a long time. I have said previously, if at any time during that period you'd asked me to talk about our progress, I would have been too pessimistic about 3 years later. I finally thought I'd caught up after the raft of federal appeals court decisions for marriage. And then I found myself again being too pessimistic, and I now think we are on the verge of victory. And it's Indiana that turned me around. When a right-wing governor in the culturally conservative state of Indiana has to apologize for saying that religious people can use their religion to discriminate, we are very close to final victory. And I mean that. And the reason is this. There's a great quote from Adlai Stevenson that is both very funny and politically not so smart, in which a woman says to him after a speech, "Oh, Governor, that was a wonderful speech. You will get the votes of all the thinking people." And he says, "Yes, madam, but unfortunately, I need a majority." Now, that's not a good way to get a majority, but my analogy is this. I am very pleased and encouraged by the support that we get in fighting homophobia from people who are morally motivated. And that's taken us a long way. But now we have the profit motive. And what we can't do with morality alone, greed's going to do for us. What you have is the American business community saying to these people, stop with the hate. You're getting in the way of my making a profit. Get this out of here. This is Eli Lilly. We're not talking about just the granola crowd that's Whole Foods. It's Eli Lilly. It's NASCAR. It's Walmart. These are the most conservative people. And what they're saying is very simple. You're getting in the way of our making a profit. And what the businesses are saying to people is, look, we don't want the right to discriminate, because if we have the right to discriminate, we're either going to get boycotted because we do discriminate, or we're going to get boycotted because we don't discriminate. One group or the other is going to be after us. We want to be legally obligated simply to make a profit and sell to anybody. And I genuinely believe this is the beginning of the end for the bigots. And a couple of months ago, you guys, you've been involved in this, there was a concern within our community that this Religious Freedom Restoration Act was going to be a real obstacle, and it collapses. And so yes, I'll continue to push for this stuff. I'm pretty sure the Supreme Court's going to decide in favor of marriage. I think this now means that the chances of getting some anti-discrimination legislation go forward. So yeah, I do think, from my standpoint, for the quality of life, including for LGBT people, at this point, the greater need is to restore our, and people do say faith in government, but I'm not a theologian. But I think I'm going to apply what I think is a theological distinction between faith and works. And I don't think faith is the right thing. I think we got to have works. We have to have deeds. This anti-government feeling is so deeply rooted and so based on a legitimate economic reality that working people have not been treated fairly, that it's not enough. We're not going to be able to talk people out of it. We're going to have to actually demonstrate to them and do things that begin to break it. So, and the answer, to go back, is 3 weeks ago, I would have told you, no, we still got to do some LGBT stuff. I really am optimistic. I'll make my prediction. 10 or 15 years from now, LGBT prejudice will look a lot like anti-Semitism. When I was 14, as I said in this book, I said there were two reasons why I thought I'd have trouble getting elected. One, because I was gay. Two, because I was Jewish. And while I planned to be in the closet, I had outed myself with a bar mitzvah, so it was going to be a little late to... in 1954, being Jewish was a serious obstacle to professional advancement. You had the Jewish law firms and the Jewish hospitals, because Jews weren't welcome in the other places. There are no Jewish Ivy League presidents. Jews were underrepresented in elected office. That's substantially changed. Yeah, there's some angry people out there. Europe's got a problem. I think in America, anti-Semitism has dwindled to where it is not a significant socially economic problem. And I believe we are likely to see the same thing with LGBT rights. Sadly, I am not nearly as optimistic about race. And the great irony is that those of us who were gay and lesbian started out with far fewer legal rights than African Americans, and still don't have the same legal rights they have, but the attitudes have become much more tolerant and the tough, to the extent that there's still a discrimination issue with race.
So, and what's your diagnosis for how we got here? I mean, you talk about in the first bill in the Massachusetts legislature, an anti-sodomy bill, where all of your colleagues, 90% of them voted yes, just in time, and 2 seconds before, flipped their votes in this kind of prank, which, for someone like myself who came of age in the Clinton years, when LGBT issues, certainly we were nowhere near where we are today, but even something by then like that would have really been incomprehensible. And then you fast forward to a day like today when you're married and I'm married and we're making such progress. How do you think we got from point A to point B? And to your point, I mean, are there lessons or implications from that on the civil rights movement and so many of the challenges it still faces?
I think we had 12 votes in favor of abolishing the crime of sodomy for mutually consenting adults. I was one. Jim Siegel, sitting here, was another who was elected with me that same year. I think what did it, there was some strategizing, but fundamentally, I think it was the process of being honest about who we were. That is, we stopped hiding. In '72, because I was one of those hiding, there was this terrible stereotype. And what I also found when I began to lobby my colleagues, first in the state legislature and then in Congress, to opposed the prejudice, they didn't know any victims of it. They didn't know what harm it was doing. To them, it was kind of just trivialized. And as we came out, essentially, I think what happened was our reality defeated the prejudice. And it was a prejudice based on ignorance. And people suddenly, not suddenly, but they began to realize they had gay relatives, gay customers, gay teachers, gay students. And that's one of the differences, frankly, that has had us made more progress, sadly, than we are making in the racial area. Because we were genuinely integrated into the society. We started popping up. They didn't, oh, Jesus Christ, he's gay. Who knew that? But everybody knew who was black, so that the hostility there, it was not as easily overcome. And here's the problem with the prejudice. What kind of a prejudice is it when you have to be notified that you're supposed to not like someone? Well, oh, that's a wonderful person. Oh, no, she's a lesbian. Oh, Jesus, I don't like her anymore. It goes against what happened. And that was important because I remember when we first were dealing with this, even in '87, when I voluntarily came out, and I was, interesting, some of the most supportive, pro-LGBT people in Congress, straight liberals, urged me not to come out because they were afraid that it was going to be problematic and reduce my influence. Well, it turned out not to be the case. So now we then had to strategize about how to do it, and I believe, and there was a struggle within our community, and I think the side that I was on won out. Given that we are out now and we have this potential influence, how do we do it? And there was one group that thought marching and demonstrating was important. Now, I believe marching was important at first because we were the hidden minority, so it was important for people to know we were here. But fairly soon, it seemed to me, became important for us to mobilize politically, as our community has done very effectively, and sort of follow up on the positive sentiment in that way. But the foundation of it was just announcing who we are, and as I said, our reality, undermining the prejudice. The problem with race is that's not available. I mean, look, racial differences, deep-seated racial prejudices are part of America from the day white people first come here, before there was an America in the 17th century with slavery. And you have a couple hundred years of slavery. And then you have 100 years of enforced segregation. We're 60 years after the end of legal segregation, 1954. And unfortunately, attitudes encrusted in that period. And that's why it's going to be a harder fight that's of a high moral character, but we need to fight it.
There's a part in the book where it's actually something not just in the book, but in your career, this question of theories of change. How can a citizen who cares about their country, cares about their world, affect change and have their voice be heard? And one of the clear beliefs that you have is that it's easy to protest, but it's often hard to get things done. And there's one, I just got to read this one line. There's this rule that you formulated. It's if you care deeply about an issue and are engaged in group activity on its behalf that is fun and inspiring and heightens your sense of solidarity with others, you're almost certainly not doing your cause any good.
Absolutely.
So I'm curious to know how that applies to some of the racial questions that the country is facing today, and the clear transitional moment that we're in.
Very good. Well, part of the debates I've had with some of the LGBT community are based on their misreading of the progress that African Americans have made and how they've made it. One argument is, they never accepted compromise. No, you had a community. I wish people would read the book by Taylor Branch about Martin Luther King called Parting the Waters. You see there an inspirational moral leader and, in Boston terms, a very cute politician. He was smart about tactics and strategy and what you do. People said, well, you just go for everything. The first lawsuits brought by African Americans to the U.S. Supreme Court over segregation did not challenge separate but equal. They were law school cases in Oklahoma and Texas. And what they said was, okay, you say it's separate but equal, but that's not equal. You have confined us to a third-rate place. You've got to let us into your place. Not because separate but equal is inherently unconstitutional. which was the ultimate decision that they were looking for, but to show that your separate isn't equal. And they moved from there. And they also used politics. Yeah, people have talked about Gandhi and King and how they did demonstrations. Yes, because they used demonstrations when the people on whose behalf they were advocating couldn't vote. Blacks literally, physically couldn't vote in most of the South. Indians couldn't vote, obviously, in the British Empire. Once they got the right to vote, that became a much more effective tool. And I'll give you some examples. The single most effective political organization in America, person for person, and I wish it wasn't the case, is the National Rifle Association. And they don't march, they don't have shoot-ins, they don't have kill-ins. They get everybody in the organization registered to vote, and everybody in the organization writes to everybody who represents him or her in Congress. And then when the bills come up, they call you. They would call me. They knew I wasn't going to do anything. They just wanted to be on my agenda. And then let me give you the best example of my recent frustration. Occupy and the Tea Party. I didn't agree with everything Occupy advocated. I thought some of their economics were a little shaky, but I certainly agreed with their general thrust. And the Tea Party I mostly disagreed with. Well, there are a few Tea Party people you can work with, both on legalizing drugs and cutting the military. There's a little honest libertarianism there. But here's the difference. The Tea Party, sadly, became very effective by getting involved in the political process, and Occupy had emotionally satisfying demonstrations that left very good or lasting public policy impact. The short answer is that when the right gets mad, now it has to do with who's patriotic and who believes in the system and who makes broader criticism, but essentially the problem that has frustrated me is that when the right gets mad, they vote, and the left gets mad, they march. And voting beats marching in terms of getting results.
I mean, particularly the moment that I think of that's similar to the structure of the NRA, or the potential structure, ironically, is right after Obama's first election in 2009. I mean, there was this immense grassroots machine of people who had been not just marching and protesting, but knocking on doors, making phone calls,
Exactly.
the nuts and bolts of organizing. And they were all sort of teed up to, go to potentially fight for the president's legislative agenda in 2009, and some combination of leaders in the White House and in the party decided in the short term that they didn't want to create that kind of army. And it seems, I mean, do you think that's indicative of something that is in general problematic on the left? Because it's more difficult to find organizations that look like, the NRA's organizing tools on the left. Is that something that's just endemic in the issues or the causes of the way that we express ourselves, or is it just a
I don't know.
happenstance
I
of
do
history?
think with President Obama, whom I strongly support and think has done a great job, and whom I think deserves a great deal of support for that Iran deal. I think this is the defining issue now in the country. But a little side, I got it, Iran at some point, I'm sorry, but my philosophical guide in making decisions about public policy was a great 20th century thinker named Henny Youngman. Some of you will have to Google him. He was a great comedian. And he was part of that tradition that made fun of wives and mothers-in-law, but he had one very profound joke. How's your wife? Compared to what? That is the basis on which I make every decision. And compared to either war or no deal, this Iran deal, I'm for it. But beyond that, the problem that we have is I think the president, who, as I said, I greatly supported, made one mistake. And I think this is why he was not ready to mobilize deploy that army as much. And by the way, you're right, it was an army. And there weren't a lot of marches and demonstrations on behalf of the president. There was, thanks to you and others, careful, calculating, effective organizing, getting our people registered, getting them to vote, which is what pays off here. Now, some of the hoopla is important to kind of keep people's spirits up. But that's only important if it follows through with getting people to vote. President Obama at one point said that he was going to govern in a post-partisan manner. Now, I knew the Republican Party pretty well by then. And when he said he was going to govern in a post-partisan manner, he gave me post-partisan depression. Because I knew that as much as that was a good idea, it wasn't possible. I mean, I'd been working with George Bush in the financial crisis, I spent all of 2008 defending Ben Bernanke and Henry Paulson against right-wing fundamentalist free enterprise Republicans who were getting in the way of any effective effort to deal with the financial crisis. And I think for that reason, the president may have delayed, in effect, going to legitimate war there, and thought maybe he could work with them. And the answer was obviously that he couldn't. And I do. And by the way, when people ask what happened to bipartisanship, it's very simple. Obama got elected, and the Republicans defected. Because I ask you to contrast the support Democrats who controlled Congress gave the Bush administration in 2007 and 2008 with the absolute unyielding obstructionism that President Obama encountered from them in 2009 and 10.
What's changed over time? I mean, has the partisanship, I think we all feel like it's gotten worse. In your estimation, has it? And
Yeah.
What's caused?
Absolutely right. What's caused it is this. In a healthy capitalist democracy with some social concern, you have a private sector that creates the wealth and a public sector that has to set the rules by which that wealth is created, that does things that are public goods that the private sector doesn't even try to do, and that does some redistribution so that you don't get an excessive inequality. And generally in America, we've had a Democratic Party and a Republican Party, each believed in both. But the Democrats were more for pushing the public sector ahead, the Republicans, the private sector. Where to draw the line between the two was the conflict. And it was considered to be people of goodwill differing with each other. It starts with Newt Gingrich. It starts with Newt Gingrich deciding and being explicit that the Republicans would never take power unless he demonized the Democrats. And he forced out of office the then minority leader, Bob Michael, because he was too friendly to Tip O'Neill and the Democrats. And he began saying, no, the Democrats are not reasonable people with whom we disagree. They're corrupt. They're immoral. They're treasonous. Well, we responded to somewhat in kind because you can't have unilateral disarmament. That introduced a certain element, but there was still some working together. And then came the Tea Party. And terrible frustration to me that it is Republican policies of not regulating the financial sector. Some of the Democrats, the Clinton administration was a little slow on that, but it was essentially the Republicans, beginning when they took over in 2000, who totally deregulated everything, opposed our efforts to rein in bad mortgages. The liberals were trying to stop these mortgages to low-income people. The conservatives said, no, that was free enterprise. So what happens is we have this terrible crash because of these policies. We then, the Democrats, are responsible in trying to deal with it. We work with the Bush administration, and we then get blamed by people who are angry because of what was done. And I said before, we're seen as a party of government. Take bailouts. People will tell you the Democrats are doing these bailouts. There were 5 bailouts in the 2008 into 2009 period. Every single one was initiated by George Bush. Every single one. Bear Stearns, AIG, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the automobile industry, and the TARP. Well, we get blamed for it. And I think what happened was that at that point, you got a growth within the Republican Party who no longer believed in government. That is, it went from a contest between Bob Dole, who thought the private sector should have more authority, and the Democrats who thought the public sector should, to a Republican Party that now does not see any value in the private sector, and that in the public sector. And that's, by the way, why there was this difference in partisanship. There's a Republican president. The Democrats have an impulse to embarrass him politically. Of course we do. That's the nature of politics. But we also have an impulse to cooperate with them because we care about government. We care about delivering services to people. The way it works now, a Democratic president does not have the benefit of that because you have a Republican Party that has the instinct to embarrass him and has no interest in the government working. So this is new. It is new that you have a Republican Party that consists of a lot of people who literally don't think government has any value. And if you think I'm exaggerating, Grover Norquist, who was one of their gurus, who's our local guy, I'm very proud that one of his first campaigns, as my sister Doris will remember, was to try to defeat me in 1980 when he got behind the John Birch Society guy who almost beat me. It was a tough year when I first ran for Congress. But he had said what he would like to do with government is to shrink it, put it in the bathtub, and have it go down the drain. These are literally people who think, other than military and maybe some police, they don't see any role for the government. They are dismantled. Look, these are the people. Dwight Eisenhower, the great moderate Republican, his signature achievement was the interstate highway system. The Republican Party in the House today wants to dismantle that. They do not want to go forward with the interstate highway system. Their answer is return it to the states. And then they'll tell you state not to do anything because they'll lose in the interstate competition. So yes, you're exactly right. The partisanship has gotten much worse because the constraint against negativism that comes from believing that there's some role for government has disappeared. Yeah. And that's where the Republican Party is.
Do you think that social media and technology in general has played a role in that? I mean, we're all in our own little bubbles on Facebook or Twitter on any given day, and some people claim that that's made it so that you just hear the echo chamber and you just hear the people who agree with you all day. Other people would say, well, you get exposed to all kinds of other ideas. I don't know, what's your
take? Yes. First of all, you're exactly right. 40 years ago, people tended to get the same information. Yeah. They interpreted it differently. Today, and it's particularly true of the activists, the people who are most active, both on the left and the right, live in parallel, separate media universes. And the problem with that is not simply that people get reinforcement. And here's where compromise becomes difficult. Each side thinks not only that its position is morally correct, but that they're in the majority. Mm-hmm. And if you think you're in the majority, why would your advocates, the people who represent your viewpoint, be compromising? They must be selling out. They must be corrupt. So that, for example, 2009, when many of my friends, people who I was proud to represent, I would have meetings about health care, and they would say, well, why don't you guys do the single-payer system, which I'm all for. I think Medicare works very well. The answer was, well, we don't have the votes for single-payer. And what I got back from a lot of people was, how can you say that? Everybody I know is for single-payer or for the public option. So they didn't believe me when I said we didn't have the votes. That is similarly the case on the right. They have it worse than we do. The other problem with social media is this, and it's not just social media, it's the media in general. Negativism has become the coin of journalism. I have a good friend, Bob Kaiser, who wrote a great book about how we adopted the financial reform bill called Act of Congress. And I complained to him about this. He was a deputy managing editor of the Washington Post, been a journalist for 50 years. And he said, yeah, this he told me a couple years ago. He quoted, I think it was Len Downey, who'd been the managing editor of the Post, who said, yeah, I wish young journalists today were as skeptical of bad news as they are of good news. You give them good news, they're out there to refute it. Tell them something bad, they can't wait to get it in the paper. And by the way, I join in some of my friends on the left. If, yes, government does a lot of bad things and dumb things. It does do some good things. But if all people here are the dumb things and the bad things and never hear about anything good, and there's this constant denigration, that contributes to the negativism. And I think this is a serious contribution by some on the left. As I said, this is this kind of intellectual voter suppression that I wish people would stop doing. And I just talk about it. It's hard to kind of just talk people out of it. But yes, I think the prevalence of negative stuff. So I guess here's the summary. If you're on the left, what you do in social media is talk about all the stupid things people in government do from the right, and vice versa. Nobody talks about the good things anybody do, and that has a cumulative negative effect.
It is interesting, though. You see that, I think you're starting to see the differences generationally in that. I think, obviously, you turn on the nightly news, it's still, carnage, gore, and the worst scandals in politics. But generationally, a lot of the most successful websites, news outlets, even social media platforms are those that are trying to find some way to tell positive, inspirational stories. So it's not clear, though, that those stories then, to your top line point, trigger positive thoughts about government or government's ability to solution. But I feel like in some ways this might be a
I'm glad to hear that.
changing for the better.
I've been in a lifelong war with inanimate objects, and I'm not good with things, and so I don't pay as much attention. But I will. But let me give you one example. Jon Stewart is very funny. And a few years ago, Jon Stewart complained to the people who did Crossfire that their constant bickering was negative. But I think Jon Stewart's effect has been somewhat negative, as has been Stephen Colbert's, because nothing ever good is ever chronicled on those shows. Everybody in politics is a fool or a knave, and that's problematic. So I'm glad to hear there are some websites that do the other. I would contrast that with Bill Maher, whose show I like to do, because he is a guy who has good guys and bad guys and talks about good things and negative things. But there is this popularity of the criticism that I think has a damaging effect.
So I want to switch gears here for a second and talk about your real deep love for campaigning. One of my favorite few lines from the book was the one where you described the experience, and if you'll indulge me just reading a couple lines here. While you are contemplating the possibility of utter failure, you are also expected to pretend that you enjoy 12 to 14-hour stints, cheerfully introducing yourself to strangers, many of whom wish you would leave them alone. You repeat yourself 8 or 10 times a day to audiences, an ordeal alleviated only by encounters with journalists whose objective is to expose, embarrass, or confound you. And then from time to time, these ordeals will be set aside for a debate, which will be judged significant only if you or your opponent says something stupid, clearly erroneous, or politically damaging. One of the things you don't talk a lot about in the book until the 2010 campaign is the role of money in politics and the campaigning, and the immense amount of time both candidates and sitting Congress people spend on the phones dialing for dollars. What's your take on the rising influence of money in politics? Is it as egregious? Is it as bad a situation as it seems to all?
Well, it's not quite as bad as some people describe it. It's wholly painful. That you talked about my attitude towards campaigning. My campaign manager, Jim Siegel, my finance chair, Nancy Corman, my sister Doris, we're all saying, yeah, we've been there. Actually, Jim said that he thought his job when I first ran was to try to minimize my contact with voters.
The opposite of everybody.
As a form of damage control. But as far as money is concerned, yeah, it is a terrible influence. And let me be clear, this is not just liberals complaining because the right wing has more money. There's a philosophical point here. I talked about the two sectors, private and public, and they're both essential for a healthy democracy and an efficient and profitable one. They operate on very different principles. The private enterprise free market system operates on the principle of inequality. The more money you have, the more influence you have. That helps the system work. And the more you can intelligently figure out what consumer preferences are, the more money you get, you can serve it. On the other hand, we have a political system which is supposed to be based on one person, one vote. So in the economic system, money gives you more influence. In the political system, it's one person, one vote. What the Supreme Court of the United States, under its conservative rule, has done is to tear down that barrier and to allow the inequality principle of the private market system to flood out and dilute equality. Now, what it does, by the way, it's two things. First of all, its most terrible influence is in who gets elected. People say, well, they just do these things to get campaign contributions. Sadly, many of the people who are elected, you don't have to give them campaign contributions once they're elected. That's what they were elected to do. And yes, it's a diversion. You have to spend a lot of time. With all that, I want to say, I don't want people to go to the conclusion that that's all that counts. Money has an enormous influence, but if votes get activated, they will kick money's ass. The problem is they don't usually get activated. Let me give you some examples. Financial reform. We went through all these years of deregulation, and people like Brooksley Born wanted to regulate derivatives and got swamped. And then there was a terrible crisis. And so for that 2-year period, 2009 and 2010, we won some issues because people were so angry. Let me quote our great Senator, Elizabeth Warren. The day that the committee I chaired passed the bill setting up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Elizabeth was there. She was an integral part of our effort. And the press asked her after the committee meeting, well, do you have something to say, Professor Warren? And professor was probably Howie Carr, Professor Warren. So that was a term, for the right wing, that's a term of abuse, professor. So reflecting, no doubt, their unhappy experiences as students. But she said, very movingly and profoundly, they told me not even to try this, setting up an independent consumer bureau. They told me not even to try this because the banks always win, but they didn't win today. That I wish I could repeat to everybody, but that's the exception. Let me give you another example. You're much more familiar with this in what it means. Most of the big money in America was against net neutrality. The big money did not like net neutrality. By the time that fight was over, you couldn't find anybody who was ever against it. Somehow there was a bill, Casper the Ghost must have introduced that bill, because the public spoke out. And it happened once before when there was efforts to do some of this. Now, look, frankly, I'm a little skeptical of the insistence of some younger people that they have a right to read and hear for free things that other people worked hard to make. But that's my own personal opinion. But just to give you the political analysis, net neutrality had the votes, anti-net neutrality had the money. It was no contest. Now, that doesn't mean that we always get that. It does mean that if public opinion gets mobilized, it will win. It is hard to do that, and the answer morally is it shouldn't have to be that hard. It shouldn't have to take a terrible threat or a crisis. Right. The answer, by the way, people say, what do we do about it? Very simple. I have to make you can be on either side of the issue. The election of 2016 is going to decide, for example, what about money? The Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, 5-4, that said there were no barriers to spending money. Ordinarily, a court decision is a strong precedent, stare decisis in Latin, let the decision stand. You can't have this total upheaval. So there's a lot to be said for when a decision is made for letting it stand. But a 5-4 hotly contested decision does not have that presumption of immortality. And I believe that if the next president is someone who doesn't like that decision, and given the age of the Supreme Court justices now, within 4 years and almost certainly within 8, that president will have the ability to appoint people who will overturn that decision. And that's one of the things people ought to be clear about. It's up. 2016, whether or not we do anything about climate change, whether we repeal financial reform, whether we do, this is going to be a very consequential election. But the answer is it has a terrible influence day to day. It can be overcome, but it shouldn't take in a democracy based on one person, one vote, so much effort to overcome it.
Absolutely. So with the few minutes that we have remaining, I want to do just a few rapid-fire kind of questions. What's your assessment of the 2016 landscape? Hillary Clinton, the nominee, is she going to win?
Hillary Clinton's the nominee. I don't think anybody cares what email server she used. And let me say this, because one of the arguments, well, there she goes again. From 1993 through 1998, I was deeply enmeshed in the investigations of the Clintons, first on the Bank Committee, then in the Judiciary Committee. And I had the chance to ask Kenneth Starr in 1998 when he appeared before us, Mr. Starr, you investigated Whitewater, you investigated the FBI files, you investigated the travel office. What's your conclusion? And the conclusion was there was nothing negative that he had to say about either President Clinton or Hillary Clinton. People ought to understand that all the Clinton scandals, there were 11 counts of impeachment, there were 11 ways to say oral sex. So this notion that Hillary Clinton somehow has this trail, absolutely untrue. And I think she will be the nominee because she represents a pretty broad consensus of the Democrats. And I understand there were some of my friends, there were liberals who weren't happy to think that we're in the majority. Oh, there must be something the matter with us if everybody agrees with us. We're supposed to be, the spark plug. Well, I think if you look at most liberal issues, she's a little more hawkish than I would like, but so is the president these days. She represents a pretty broad consensus. When there was a chink in financial reform, she put out a strong statement against it. Paul Krugman noted, by the way, in his columns, that in 2008 she was to the left of President Obama, then Senator Obama, on domestic issues. So yes, I believe she will be the nominee and will do very well.
What's the future of ENDA, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act? When do you think that will actually come up for a vote?
Well, I had been saying that the next time we get a Democratic House, Senate, and President, we will be able to pass a fully inclusive ENDA. Transgender was a problem. We were, to my unpleasant surprise, and Nancy Pelosi's, we didn't have the votes for it because we had sort of taken for granted transgender was new to people. The transgender community is now done in a compressed period what the LGBT community did before, they've introduced themselves, and we're over that. So I had been thinking it would take a Democratic House, Senate, and President, but the reaction to Indiana has made me more optimistic because you now have people saying, oh no, we're not trying to discriminate against gays and lesbians. Good, then put it in the law. I mean, this is the first time some of these very conservative people have ever said that we should be protected, those of us who are gay and lesbian. So I think it is now possible, if you got a Democratic president and Senate, that they can initiate something, and that there would be enough pressure on this House, if it stayed Republican, for the Speaker to have to let the bill come to the floor. A majority of Republicans would vote against it. It would pass. So I now think within a few years we could very well get that. Now, unfortunately, people can't stand prosperity. There are some in the LGBT community who want to do a much broader bill, saying we got to be like the Civil Rights Bill of '64. But the Civil Rights Bill of '64 was a narrow bill. It didn't have housing. It didn't have voting rights.
Right.
So I believe if we focus on a fully inclusive transgender LGBT bill, we can get it through.
And one more before we open it up. What's the route to legalization of marijuana? I know it's something that you're talking a lot about these days. Is it through the courts? How do we get the executive branch to change? Is
No,
that
it
something
probably won't be through the courts because it's hard to say that you have a constitutional right to smoke something. I think it will be through the public. I disagree with a lot of my friends on the left who have this idealized view of the public. And, the voters, the voters are ahead of the politicians. Well, not always. But yes, on drugs. And I think what's going to happen to drugs is essentially what happened on same-sex marriage. Now, it's true the courts ultimately decided that, but the public was on the verge of doing that. We won 4 referenda in 2012, and marijuana and same-sex marriage follow the same model. They are both activities that some people want to engage in that don't do anybody else any harm. But there are people who disapprove of them and want to ban them. But in America today, you're not supposed to say that you don't want people to do something because you don't want them to enjoy it. I mean, it's the old H.L. Mencken definition of Puritanism, the haunting fear that someone somewhere may be having a good time. People don't like to get stuck with that. So they have to, in both marijuana and same-sex marriage, and they're really quite similar, people invent negative social consequences. Oh, it's not that I disapprove of it, but if people can smoke marijuana, or if we have same-sex marriage, bad things will happen. If people smoke marijuana, there'll be a lot more driving accidents or whatever. If you have same-sex marriage, it'll destabilize society. Now, what happens in both cases, first same-sex marriage, thanks to the great Margaret Marshall and that Supreme Judicial Court, and also with marijuana, thanks to now Colorado and Washington, but it started with medical marijuana. And I know the argument against medical marijuana is, yeah, medical marijuana. That's just a ruse so people can smoke marijuana. The answer is yeah, true, and that's good. Because that's how we got people to see that was crap, the arguments against it. What happens is both get legalized. Neither one has any negative social consequence, and people go on to say, okay. So I think marijuana is, there's a glitch in Colorado. You know what the glitch is? The $60 million that they are collecting from the sale of marijuana may not be able to go into the Treasury because of some rigid anti-tax thing they passed. But I think in both cases we will see the legalization. And one other argument about marijuana, and I would extend it, because I believe that's true of recreational drugs as well. Cocaine, there's a great hypocrisy. There have been high-functioning white people using cocaine forever in this society. They don't go to jail. And even heroin. Nobody hits somebody over the head because she's using heroin. People hit you over the head because they want to get the money to buy the heroin, which we can deal with. But here's one of the arguments I make for the legalization or the stop prosecuting people. Obviously, I'm obsessed to some extent with our need to deal with race. Legally, African Americans have full rights, but in its application, the laws against recreational drugs are the strongest manifestation of racism in practice. Look at the enforcement of the laws against marijuana. Look at crack cocaine versus powder cocaine. That is the worst friction point between law enforcement and African Americans. Society should not have laws on the books that it's ambivalent about enforcing. It's unfair to the cops, who should not be put in that situation. So, and I believe that you're going to see within 10 years substantial legalization of marijuana.
Just one quick follow-up on that. Do you think it's actually possible for the left and the far right to come together on this issue, like the Rand Paul, Cory Booker?
No, two points. Yes, and two issues. both of which are my two big issues, so I feel. The last amendment I sponsored in the House before I retired was a $1 billion cut in the military budget, co-sponsored by Mick Mulvaney, the Tea Party congressman from South Carolina. Some of the Tea Party people are intellectually consistent, some of the people on the right. Now, generally, they believe, the inconsistent ones are Lindsey Graham, John McCain, our neighbor, Senator Kelly Ayotte, the big hawks. They believe that the federal government is totally incapable of achieving any social progress within America, but somehow can go into Iraq and work miracles of creating cohesion. This ineffective government at home can go into foreign societies. The Tea Party people are consistent. Seriously, they understand that, I think they exaggerate it at home, but they do understand it's harder to do it in foreign ways, and they are serious about cutting the deficit. So I believe, and they want to pull back from this America must rule the world. So I believe on both, and of course it's also the drug stuff is very expensive. And in both cases, by the way, it does not work to say, oh, we're going to do it more efficiently. You cannot expect to send the American military into battle and save money. If we're going to send them into battle, and similarly, if you're going to lock people up, you can't save money. I've had people say, well, why does it cost more money to send someone to prison than to send them to the state university? A very easy answer. Nobody tries to escape from the state university. That's very expensive. So I do think there is a left-right coalition around. Now, we will then differ about how to spend the money. They'll want to put it all in the deficit. But the first thing is to get it. And yeah, I do plan to continue to work on it. I had very good relations with Ron Paul on legalizing marijuana and cutting the military. And then he took himself too seriously. In early 2012, I approached him on the floor to sign a letter to the president. They have this terrible situation where the bank regulators have not allowed banks to take money from the marijuana people. They have to have cash around. Yeah. They should just cut through it. And we're trying to make some progress on that. And I asked him to sign the letter. And Ron, he was then in Iowa trying to become president. And he said, Barney, I can't sign that. My people tell me you're killing me in Iowa. Just associating with me was not helping in the Republican caucus.
All right, well, with that, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. There are two mics here in the rows. If you'd like, please just approach the mic. We'll start over here on my left.
Yeah. My name is Ellen Kagan, and I know you very well from Brookline because I'm very active in healthcare reform, and I appreciate everything you've done. And I remember your mother very well, too. I just have a question about Obama. What is your opinion of him, and what is his role in all of this that we're talking about today?
He's a very smart man who has very good values. He confronts a very difficult situation. I think he has, on the whole, been right in things. He made this initial mistake, in my judgment, of overestimating their willingness to cooperate. And that led him to suggest that we might want to curtail cost of living increases for older people who were making $2,000 a month. He's moved away from that. My only concern is this. He's being exposed to pressure, and I really think this is the case for supporting him. He did the right thing in Iraq and in Afghanistan of withdrawing. He's under great pressure to go back in, and I want to support him and say, no, there's nothing we can do other than indefinite occupation. But in general, I have found him very good, and on financial reform, he provided exactly the kind of support we needed. So
One other question, I'll be very, Obamacare. I'm from single payer, so it was kind of...
It's the best we could do at the time, and I think it is a way, it is working well. The horror stories are not there. The Republicans win in 2016, they'll roll it back. But in fact, having that increased public participation is helpful, although I will say it's an example of my point. If President Obama, or Bill Clinton before him in '93, had $50 or $60 billion in surplus funding available, it would have been possible to expand health care in ways that would have not threatened people. But I think if Hillary Clinton's elected president, within a few years after that, the health care bill will be safe, and it will be the basis for further expansion. By the way, on the whole role of the public sector in healthcare, I do like to point out to people that if you poll the consumers of healthcare, by far the most popular form of healthcare in America is socialized medicine. If you go into the Department of Veterans Affairs, you drive a car into a government parking lot, and you go into a government building, and you get into a government bed, and a government doctor tells a government nurse to stick you with a government needle. It is totally socialized medicine, and the people who get it are very happy with it.
Thank you.
How bad do you think the healthcare.gov debacle was to our previous conversation of
It was very
trusting
damaging.
government, and how could they do socialized medicine? They can't even get the website to work.
Well, two things. First of all, the fact that both President Clinton and President Obama, a lot of similarities there, had to do the very important social goal of extending health care to people who didn't have it by claiming, without putting extra money in, ignited all these suspicions. They're going to give the poor people health care and take it away from me. So we had to challenge the union over the health care.
Yeah.
And this, serious problems. We would have been much better off. But then it was starting to subside, and I think you're exactly right to bring that up. The fiasco with the rollout was awful, and I do fault the president for that. I do not understand, given how important this was to him personally and politically, why he wasn't being briefed once a week, and how they allowed that to happen. That was a great disaster. And one other factor about trust. He should never have said, if you like your health care, you can keep it, because that wasn't going to be true, and we shouldn't say things that aren't true. But one of the things that I forgot to mention, I'm looking at Bobby Hayes over there, and it's one of the important things for the Democrats. One of the things I hope liberals will understand is that there is a direct causal relationship between the successful long-term assault on labor unions and the eroding economic position of working people. And one of the things that the Democrats are starting to get back doing is that, it's going to take a little while. There's one thing that I just need to share with everybody as an example. Volkswagen announces that it's willing to have the UAW come into its plant in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And so they're going to have an election, because you have to have an election. Volkswagen says, we work with unions in Germany. So they're about to have an election. And Senator Robert Corcoran, not a Tea Party guy, a mainstream Republican conservative, announces on behalf of the Tennessee Republicans that if Volkswagen workers vote for a union, they will withhold public funds that they have promised for an expansion of Volkswagen, an offer they couldn't refuse. Even with that, they get about 45% for the union election. Clearly, absent that threat, there would have been a heavy majority for the election. But then here's the real kicker. People go to Corcoran and say, well, what do you care? The company wants to have a union. Why did you try to stop it? He said, if Volkswagen has a union, first they'll push up wages. Very significant, because when they're selling right-to-work laws, they argue that unions don't do anything, but they know they do. So they're acknowledging that unions raise wages. But here's the worst of it. He said, and if wages go up at the Volkswagen plant in Chattanooga, that will put upward pressure on wages throughout Tennessee. And if wages go up in Tennessee, we will be diminished in our ability to lure industry from other states. So don't let anyone tell you that, inequality is just a matter of natural effects. Sorry for the diversion.
Please.
Congressman Frank, thank you very much for your service to the United States. I'd like to ask you, you mentioned early on the fact that it's critical that we find a way for our younger children who are of low income to go to college. 2 weeks ago, BU announced that their tuition alone, is going to be $63,000 next year. How in the world is a child in the inner city of Boston going to be able to afford that type of expense, since there is no middle class any longer? It's lower class and higher class. What are we going to do, and what is the federal government going to do to help?
What we should be doing is restoring the flow of funds to the states instead of cutting back on it, and making it possible for people to go to a first-rate public university for $1,000 a year or less, the way it used to be. This is one of the things that working-class people understand. You used to be able to go to state schools. The problem now is because of the anti-government feeling and the cutbacks in state spending and the extent to which prisons are eating up state money, to go back to one of my other issues. There are very few genuine state colleges and universities anymore. That is, almost none of them get 50% or more of their funding. So the first thing to do is to significantly increase the capacity of the public universities to educate people. Bristol community colleges are great. In the district I used to represent, the president told me that he had couple hundred applicants for nursing and 30 spots. Yet the hospitals in the area needed nurses, but the state had cut back its funding. So we have to restore public funding of that system. Secondly, we increase grants and loans to students elsewhere. I also believe there's a competitive effect if the private universities may have to react to the public universities. But it is certainly within our capacity to say that every student who wants to should be able to get a first-rate education at a publicly funded university for a small amount of money.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yes, Irvin L. Tootsie Russell, former staff of Congressman
And a
Frank.
Vietnam combat veteran who I was pleased to have working for me as my aide.
Barney, you were a staunch advocate for the reversal of government pension offset and the windfall elimination, and there's still people out there wondering what would be the best position for
Right,
them to
It's
take.
a complicated issue. Ronald Reagan did not like the public sector. And one of the things he got through was legislation that penalized public employees who had a public pension and were also receiving Social Security. It was called the pension offset. And your Social Security could be reduced by the amount you were getting in a public pension. Many of us tried to fight that. The problem that we faced was that only a few states were covered by this. There were a lot of states did not have their public employees in Social Security, and we never had the support to do it. Unfortunately, it was one where only a handful of states, Ohio, Massachusetts, and others were involved, and I'm sorry to say that we lost that fight because we never had the votes.
Is there anything that they can do to pursue it, continue it?
I wish there were. They can lobby people. They can try to get people in other states, but I don't see any prospect.
Thank you.
Hello, Congressman. Thank you very much for coming tonight. I have two questions regarding public education. I am in my 9th year teaching social studies in Millis, your former district, and I'm very, very passionate, clearly, about civic responsibility, social justice, civil equality. But one thing that I find today, and I'm very involved in the teachers union as well, is the lack of public education, and how that the private sectors are kind of making their way into the learning conditions and teaching conditions of our students and public employees. So my two questions for you is, one, what is your take on that? The Koch brothers and the Bill Gates and all these companies that think they know what's best for the students in the state and the country. And also, where are we going with labor unions? First of all, I know that there's a number of, in the past, and probably more coming, Republican governors that threaten collective bargaining rights for teachers and other, workers. So I just want to get your 2 cents on that, and thank you.
Two things. I'm not an expert on the substance of education. I will tell you a couple of things. I am skeptical of the notion that our problem is that teachers aren't trying hard enough. And in the years that I was a representative, you get invited into schools. And I found, frankly, in most of the schools I went into, the students seemed to me to be learning, things were going well. The exception were those schools where the students came from very poor backgrounds, where they were not well brought up in terms of material support, where they didn't have a good place to sleep, a place to study, they didn't have a good breakfast. It is very hard to teach 5- and 6-year-olds who are living in those difficult conditions. And I think that's one of the things we need to do is to not expect teachers to be able to undo all the problems of society. Having said that, I do have questions about tenure in some cases, and I do think that's one of the things. I'm for strong union protection. I think strong union protection and strong tenure can sometimes be an overlay. I'm also skeptical about the testing method. I voted against No Child Left Behind. I did not think that worked very well. I guess I'm persuaded by a woman named Diane Ravitch, who was one of the, she was an assistant secretary of education under George H.W. Bush, and was very much a believer that teachers needed to shape up and stop miseducating students. And she wrote a very persuasive book saying it's much more complicated than that. And that's what I'm inclined to believe. As to unions, I was glad I remembered to say this. So that's a very important thing. And the Democrats are finally doing the right thing. People haven't noticed, but President Obama's NLRB, National Labor Relations Board, is issuing a lot of good decisions about the right of workers to be represented. That's another issue that will be on the ballot. Meanwhile, you have the governor of Wisconsin. I mean, the New York Times, I love them, but Jesus, the other day they had an article that maybe there would be a political negative for the governor of Wisconsin because he's allergic to dogs. Did you read that? They have a front page. And I said, well, why don't they write about the fact that he's allergic to unions? Because that's much more important.
Thank you.
Let's take another one from this side over here where the line was a little bit queued up.
To bring some of the wonderful ideas that you've discussed tonight, and I'm sure the choir agrees with, to fruition, the Democratic Party has to capture both houses of Congress, besides holding on to the presidency. And yet the Democratic Party has not had a creative idea about building a coalition to do that since the FDR coalition broke down over the Civil Rights Act, and the South was lost. So how is the Democratic Party going to put together, in today's situation, a coalition that will give us a chance to win both houses of Congress?
Well, I disagree that we have been working on this, but I think we should sharpen the economic piece. I agree that we have this issue, and I think the major problem has been the anger of white working class men to the inability of the government to do anything about their economic position. So I believe, and the president's done that. If you look at his budget, minimum wage, making it possible for people starting with free community college tuition, doing some things to increase the progressivity of the tax system. I think the answer is that the missing piece there is this segment of people who would vote for FDR, and I think we need to focus very explicitly on what economic benefits they will get if we win.
In order to do that, can we do a better job of defining what business does that we like, as opposed to what the financial sector does that we don't like?
Oh, I don't think Democrats have been neglectful of that. I think, for example, Silicon Valley has a lot of very Democratic support. I don't know that Democrats, in fact, I think many Democrats are quite supportive of much of what business does.
Go over here.
Congressman Frank, again, I appreciate both your coming out and your service to our country in many ways. As a child of the 50s and 60s, I grew up in a time and country that believed in a we. The collective effort was what we were about. You know, that's how we won World War II. That's how we got the prosperity of the 50s and 60s. And that's why unions were so strong, and that seems to have been diminished. And I personally marked the death or the assassination of President Kennedy as the time that our country went from we to I. And I think that much of what you've talked about is so many taking care of themselves, not the we. And privatization is one of those things, and the defeats of the unions is another. Do you agree with that, and what can we do to bring the we back into the equation?
Well, I disagree to some extent. I don't think it was purely attitudinal. I want to go back. The reason we were so prosperous in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s was that we survived World War II, and the rest of the world that had any economy was wrecked. And we had an unusual advantage. We tended to think the exception was the norm. Thomas Piketty talks about this, about people mistaking an exception for the norm. And what happened was, as the economic advantages of that period faded, people began to worry more about themselves. It's easier for people to feel the we when they're doing well. But when they feel threatened, then they pull away. So This is not for me a matter of faith, it's a matter of works. I think we have to do the right thing in public policy, and that will develop things.
So I want to make sure we get out of here on time. So we have time for one more question, then I have one last one. We'll take it on this side.
I guess you're saving the best for last. I, too, would like to thank you, Congressman Frank, for all you've done, speaking out, coming out, and serving this country in a way that is not matched by many. I also want to point out that, in my humble opinion, I think we've missed the perfect solution for the whole money problem. Just put a woman on the paper money and it'll all go away. In reality, though, I'm a member of the Randolph Democratic Town Committee and a member of the subcommittee on the State Democratic Party communications. And the thing that I find is something that we lack as Democrats and as people in this country, and I do see the trees, not just the forest, and that is we live in a politically bullying society. We teach our students that bullying cannot be accepted, and yet it's demonstrated all the time among politicians. And the thing that I think we need to put in our schools, not just teaching them that bullying is unacceptable, we need to teach them about government. We are not doing the job. I am about a year younger than you are, or a year older. I don't know. I did the math earlier, but, you know, I'm 72, so I forgot it already. I think that we are missing the boat in teaching our students about our government. I've worked on campaigns. I'm presently running a voter registration event in Randolph this weekend. And I find that it's hard to get people interested.
Just because we're a little time constrained, can we just get to the question for the conference?
Yes, I wanted to ask if you have any thoughts about what we can do to enhance the mandated programs that are part of our federal education requirements so that it includes more learning about our government.
I do not think the federal government should be mandating. Listen, I'll be honest with you. I don't think we can teach students our way out of it. I again think we got to sort of do some serious stuff. What I would do to try, if I were teaching, was to say, and you do it in a neutral way to the students, do you care about climate change or not? Because that's one of the issues. I think teaching about government sort of in the abstract doesn't work. Tell them what the issues are. And say, here's one group that thinks one thing and one thinks the other. But I have no expertise in teaching people.
I think the party needs to reach out more to the young people. I think there's not enough direction going from the upper levels to the younger people.
Well, I disagree with that. You know, frankly, I'm sorry if this seems a little... That's how do you do that? Reach out and I mean, it's, what are we, a big Coke commercial or whatever, reach out and touch somebody? I mean, the fact is,
I only drink seltzer, I'm from New York.
They are resistant. I don't know what... Well, let me ask you this. You're involved in the communication. What's stopping you? It's very hard. It is very hard to do. Yes, you should keep trying. But I believe, again, we're in a vicious cycle. And I believe that we could... I think the American people are ready to cut our military spending. I wish the president would take a little more leadership in that. And once we begin doing these things, then things will follow. Good luck in trying to talk them out of their attitudes. I'm not optimistic.
So let's wrap with one last question. Since we're here in the JFK Library, I wanted to ask how JFK inspired you and how his legacy is relevant today.
Well, I'll be honest with you. I was always interested in politics. You know, in 1954, the year he got elected to the Senate. He's been a very important inspiration for me, almost posthumously. When he was saying what he was saying, I was taking it for granted. I frankly didn't need the inspiration of John Kennedy to say, get involved in government, get involved in politics. It's one of these things where you only miss the water when the well runs dry. The fact is that as I wrote the book, I realized there were two antipodal statements that governed the earlier part of my career. One was John Kennedy, ask what you can do for your country, which was a pro-communitarian statement. And I took that for granted when he said that. Not that you only did that, but that there was an obligation to work together. And I was sort of thinking that was the way we would go. And then exactly 20 years later, in his inauguration, and you know, John Kennedy and Ronald Reagan, there were no successful presidents between them. Lyndon Johnson gets forced not to run again. Nixon's driven out of office. Ford gets defeated. Carter gets defeated. So you have this run of 4 politically unsuccessful presidencies. So you have Kennedy and then you have Reagan. And what happens in that arc? Reagan then says, government is not the answer to the problem, government is the problem. So I now, and in the book, see John Kennedy as having expressed that opinion, which I guess I took for granted was right. And in retrospect, I think it's the one we need to talk about. Sadly for me, and I'm a great supporter of Bill Clinton, I'm very proud I helped defeat the impeachment, but he made the mistake, he broke the tie in a way that was more Reagan than Kennedy, because he said the era of big government is over, as if that was a good thing. Well, that suggests there's something the matter with government. When people tell me, are you for big government? I'm for smaller government. I want to say, okay, how many fewer firefighters do you want to have? How many fewer Superfund sites should we clean up? How slower should the train schedule be? And I think Bill Clinton made this mistake, and other liberals make it. It is, okay, people don't like government. We'll join in the anti-government view, but we'll support these specific programs. But the whole cannot be smaller than the sum of the parts politically any more than physically. And I think that was the mistake. I think we have to take on head on, yes, we are the party that believes in collective action along with the private sector to make things better, and here's the way we do it.
Great. Just want to remind everyone that Congressman Frank will be staying after to sign books out here in the lobby. So join me in thanking him for. Thank you.